What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we have another installment of our world-famous skyrocketing player series we do on this channel where I talk through players who have moved up in my rankings. I did a redraft rankings update on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart, like a week and a half ago, and I wanted to make a video where I talked about players who moved up, and then we had the DeAndre Hopkins bombshell dropped on us yesterday. So I figured I'd kind of put them all in one. We talk about I actually just updated the rankings today to reflect the DeAndre Hopkins move, so we'll kind of talk about the moving pieces on that team, and then we'll go into about, I think, 5 players that are skyrocketing up my rankings. So with all that being said, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
Like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen.
So the first thing we have to talk about here is the DeAndre Hopkins news. Now I thought I had a screenshot from Adam Schefter here. Actually, not from Adam Schefter. We have it from Ari Merov. I hope that I'm not butchering that name. But DeAndre Hopkins signs with the Tennessee Titans, and we have a lot of moving parts here that I wanted to get into just in terms of the redraft fantasy football fallout from this information. Now, first up at the top, the player who is actually the only guy in the entire list that is actually skyrocketing in my rankings. The rest of them are actually falling in my rankings, but I figured it's an ADP movement video regardless. But the guy who moved up the most in my rankings, Ryan Tannehill. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what this little screenshot is, this is a screenshot from Underdog Fantasy. If you're new there, make sure you are hopping on there. Underdog Fantasy is a best ball platform. We stream there every Thursday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern, every Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern, every Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern, every single week. This summer, we're getting serious about streaming drafts. We hop on there, we do drafts, we draft best ball teams. You don't have to worry about them at the end of the year. You don't have to worry about them with waivers, trading their best ball. It sets your best lineup every single week. It's a really fun way to get some practice in, run through drafts, and just kind of get a feel for the landscape this year. Again, promo code RON gets you a deposit match up to $100. There's a link in the description and the comment section down below. You click on it, it takes you to Underdog Fantasy. It uses my promo code RON. Now with Ryan Tannehill, I only have my top 150 done right now for redraft, right? Like, give me a break. It's late July. I'll have probably like a top 250, 220-ish, probably by like the first week of August. Again, that'll all be on the Patreon. But I figured I would rank Ryan Tannehill just for the sake of this video. He was QB 31 in ADP. He's still QB 31 in ADP. But this is where I ended up ranking him. So I only have 18 quarterbacks ranked. So I decided to sort of rank how many quarterbacks would I have ahead of Ryan Tannehill after the DeAndre Hopkins news. And I came up with Derek Carr, Stafford, Brock Purdy, Kenny Pickett, and then I put Ryan Tannehill. So QB 23, right? QB 31 in ADP. So that's like what, like a 8-spot jump for me prior to where he was. Now when we talk about why I moved him up so high, let's talk about who Ryan Tannehill is. In my eyes, he's a very capable quarterback. Like, he's not anything special, but he was hurt last year. He had no supporting cast, right? Like, we're talking about rookie Treylon Burks. Like, Robert Woods was nothing last year. Okonkwo had some stretches, but like you're talking about like Nick Westbrook-Akine, and like we're talking really rough pass catching options here in this Titans offense. But since 2019, which I believe was the year that he joined the Titans, Ian Hartitz has a good tweet here. He was 9th in EPA per dropback, 6th in passer rating. Since 2019, 4th in yards per attempt, 6th in adjusted yards per attempt, 10th in completion percentage, and 10th in TD and interception ratio. He's been a good quarterback. Now, prior to last year, he was the QB 14, the QB 9, and the QB 9 in those previous 3 years in points per game. He has some rushing upside too, though he is like getting pretty old, so I don't want to factor that in too much, but this is a big boost, right? You get DeAndre Hopkins, and the offense isn't going to be as bad. Like, I think it's a decent receiving trio of DeAndre Hopkins, who's going to be like a very established, like kind of like alpha top dog wide receiver in this offense, like 28% target share probably. Then you have Treylon Burks, who's kind of this young ascending wide receiver. Okonkwo. There's a lot of talent. And you also have Derrick Henry that's going to at least kind of stack boxes a little bit and open things up deep, which has sort of been where Tannehill wins, is on these like play actions when the defense just kind of collapses in on Derrick Henry. So I think it's kind of a good, boost for Tannehill, and I think it also signals to us kind of the direction of the organization, right? You don't go out and pay DeAndre Hopkins like a 2-year deal, paying him a bunch of money if you want to tank and develop Will Levis. This signals to me that they plan on playing Tannehill until the season is no longer salvageable, right? Like if they start, say, like 5-9 or something, something crazy, like 3-7. And maybe they look to Will Levis and they just see what they have in the future. But if they win games and, they end up like 6-3 around week 9, like week 10, they probably just keep rolling with Tannehill, which I think is a good thing. Like the part of the risk before this move was that Tannehill wasn't going to get a full, 14 plus games, and that Will Levis would be on the field sooner or later. So I think it locks up how many games he's going to play. I think it kind of raises the ceiling of this offense. They should have more pass attempts as well with a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, so you can expect a little bit more pass volume. You can expect longer sustained drive, a little more touchdown efficiency from the entire offense. Now, the players who moved down. Now, these are going to be the only players we talk about who moved down in my rankings, but I figured you guys probably want to know, right? We have DeAndre Hopkins, Treylon Burks, Okonkwo. Now, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins first. He was my 312 as my wide receiver 19. He is now my 505 as my wide receiver 28. So he went down 9 wide receiver spots in about a round and a half. And to me, Hopkins takes a really big hit because he carries a lot of risk. We've seen a lot of these older ex-wide receivers kind of just vanish. Like we've seen it with Andre Johnson. We've seen it with Randy Moss. We've seen it with Julio Jones. We see it with a lot of guys. Like I'm trying to think of some other ones on top of my head, but there's a lot of guys where it's just like one year they have it, another year they don't. Like we saw with Des Bryant. I think Demaryius Thomas is pretty similar. When you win with physicality and size, it gets tough when you get older. Now, I was down to bet on him because there was an upside there, right? If he goes to Buffalo or he goes to Kansas City, then he could, give you like 1,200 receiving yards, maybe even lead the league in touchdowns in a system like that. But when we go to a spot like the Titans, where even all the positive things I just said with Tannehill, we're still talking about probably like a bottom 10 passing offense in the NFL. So there isn't that same ceiling to kind of offset the floor of him being a 31-year-old wide receiver who has missed 10 games due to injury the last 2 years and got popped for PEDs. So you'd never like to see that when, I feel it's almost a signal that like he's starting to lose a step a little bit if he's trying to get on PEDs, but that's kind of more narrative-based. His target share should be great, right? You can kind of project him on a median for like, 28% target share, but it's still a low-volume offense, so it's going to be tough for him to pay off in a big way. And when we're looking at DeAndre Hopkins in that range that he's going, and you're making tough decisions between DeAndre Hopkins and guys like Jerry Jeudy and Christian Watson, all of these kind of like young ascending guys, like even like a JSN, I think it gets pretty close there, where you have young ascending wide receivers with a lot more upside than a guy like DeAndre Hopkins. Like I'm not sure what the win is, right? Like you have to think about when you're picking these players, what do you win when you win? And I don't know how Hopkins ends up being like a massive league winner this year, and he holds a ton of risk. Now, when you guys say, okay, he's old, but he didn't look that bad, Adam Harstad had a really good article where we talked about this before. He talked through players don't have, on an aggregate, right? If you take the average of like 300 careers, it's going to look like a nice, like, you approach your peak, you peak, and then you kind of slowly trail off. But we see, some guys like Odell Beckham, straight up and then straight down, right? Like, not every career has that, like, magical bell curve, and it's just kind of what it looks like on average. Most players, they have their peak or whatever, and then they kind of sustain, and then they fall right off, right? Like, Harstad actually calls it death rate. Like, that's what that DR percentage is, death rate. Like, most of the time, a guy isn't going to just trail from, like, 16 points per game to 14 to 13 to 12. It's usually, 18, 16, and then 4, right? We've seen it with running backs a lot more than wide receivers, right? You can talk like Melvin Gordon, Le'Veon Bell, Todd Gurley, whatever. But it's similar with wide receivers and really all positions in general. It's just the running back cliff is just a lot earlier in their career. So DeAndre Hopkins is 31, and that would make his death rate a 21.6% death rate. So 21.6% chance just based on the careers of other 31-year-old wide receivers who were good. They had a 21.6% chance of falling off a cliff once they hit age 31, which is 4 more times as likely to fall off a cliff than, say, a random 25-year-old wide receiver, which just makes him that much more shaky. So I have him in an area right now where he's like next to Chris Godwin and Deontay Johnson and Marquise Brown, where I think he should be, right? Where these are target hogs in bad offenses. And I think that's about as high as I can go. Again, I have him wide receiver 28. Now, our next player we're going to talk through is Treylon Burks, who sadly I moved down quite a bit. I had him as my 606 as my wide receiver 35. He's now my 803 as my wide receiver 48. So just shy of 2 rounds down and like 13 wide receiver spots, Treylon Burks, because he kind of has the upside case as well, sort of shrinked where he could have been the wide receiver 1 in this offense. He's kind of figured it out with Tannehill, the ceiling was the roof with Burks, right? Like he could be, it'd be a low volume passing offense, but the ceiling was like A.J. Brown with Tannehill, right? Where it's like low volume, but he's an absolute stud and he's giving you like fringe wide receiver 1 performances. With Hopkins there, you now have somebody taking like effectively like 27% plus of the targets, and there's not that same like easy path to wide receiver 1 upside. But I will say, I think, you know, a Devonta Smith type year 2 is in his range of outcomes where he could, you know, flirt with like top 15 numbers if this offense is actually good and Hopkins is good. Like I think Hopkins being good actually almost helps Burks a little bit in terms of what his efficiency could possibly be, right? They're going to sustain more drives, they're going to have more touchdowns, more yards, you're going to have resources allocated to having to cover DeAndre Hopkins, so Treylon Burks can now kind of do his own thing and sort of play off Hopkins. And there was also, I don't have it, I wish I screenshotted it from Reception Perception, but Angelo FF on Twitter touches on it here. He said in terms of long-term development, the Hopkins signing is great for Treylon Burks, can learn the exposition from one of the best boundary receivers of this decade, while also being deployed in his more natural Z role in the meantime. So last year he was used, I believe he was used like solely as an X wide receiver, where you're going to be posted up on the outside. You know, DeAndre Hopkins is your quintessential X wide receiver. Now, a guy that Burks kind of profiles a little bit more to, you know, your Debos and your A.J. Browns, they move around the formation a lot more. You know, they win with yak, all of that. And Burks is almost playing out of position as a rookie, which is tough when you're trying to learn the NFL. Now you're learning a whole new position. So Hopkins coming in can actually put him into his more natural Z position, move around the formation, you know, mess around out of the slot, and, you know, get some more manufacturer touches around the line of scrimmage. So I think it's actually a more natural fit for him. It's just like it's a thinner, you know, needle to thread, just because you have Hopkins there taking so much off the top. But I do think, again, like a Devonta Smith type year 2, where, you know, Hopkins is kind of the main guy in the A.J. Brown role, and Burks, you know, if he's going to be talented, if he's going to be good, then that should show regardless. Like there's not a ton of other targets to be stolen from him. But again, I just think the median projection goes down so much with Hopkins that I had to move him down like the wide receiver 40s area. Now, talk about Chigo Okonkwo real quick as well. I moved him out of my top 150. I had him at my 1205 as my tight end 14. Now he's out of my top 150. I have him as tight end 16. So I didn't really move him down that much. Like I have him at 136. I only ranked 150 players and moved him out. And it really just comes down to this. He's efficient. He looks like he's talented. But it's a pretty big deal to go from a potential like top 2 target earner to being pretty much the 3rd target at best. This is a really good blurb. I always bring up Andrew Cooper. I believe he's Coop A Fiasco on Twitter, which is like a play on Lupe Fiasco, I think. And he said when you look at the tight ends that finish top 5 without being a top 2 target on their team, the results are equally scarce. You have our best good friend 2020 Robert Tonyan. Before that, the most recent is Martellus Bennett in 2014. So 2 in about 7 years. That's like what, 7 times 5, 35 top 5 tight ends. Only 2 of them have not been a top 2 target on their own team. And it makes sense, right? Like you need targets to score points, and if you're not at the top of that target totem pole, you have to win on like crazy touchdown efficiency or yak. I mean, Okonkwo can maybe get there on yak, but the touchdowns won't be there in this offense. So with him now not being like a clear top 2 target in this offense, I moved him down accordingly. Nothing too crazy because he's still kind of like this upside, like young bet, but he's not somebody that I'm crazy about in redraft this year. Now, let's talk about kind of the rest of the players that have been skyrocketing up my rankings. And first up, we actually have 4 more players. So we technically have 5 players skyrocketing up my rankings, right? You have Tannehill, and you have these next 4 players. Now, first of which, we have Chris Olave. Chris Olave. And I had him as my 304, as my wide receiver 16. I now have him as my 208 as my wide receiver 12. So I moved him up about a full round in like 4 wide receiver spots. And I realized I think I've been holding on to how I feel about Olave as a prospect, or how I felt about Olave as a prospect, way too much. You guys were kind of, you know, giving me a lot of feedback on, I believe it was like the wide receiver ranking video, and just kind of how I've been talking in streams. And I went back and I kind of looked through Olave, and I think I've been a little bit too harsh on him, because the whole idea with Olave, for me, or the whole pushback with him, has been, you know, non-early declare, round 1 wide receiver, which means usually that's a lower ceiling archetype. And he also just seemed like this downfield possession type wide receiver, and was getting, you know, your Tyler Lockett type comparisons, right? Where it's a technician, you're not going to get any missed tackles forced, no yak, down the field receiver, which is a good archetype, right? Like even like an Amari Cooper as well, where Amari Cooper has never had like a top 12 finish. Those are kind of the archetype that I've seen him in, right? Like a technician, downfield guy, can get open, can catch passes, but then anything past that, it's a little bit tough. But I think that he kind of showed last year that he's much more than that. And I think I was being unfair. These are what the model spits out, or my database spits out as his year 2 comps. Pretty much I just go like roughly 20% in both directions of year 1 PFF receiving grade, points per game, yards per out run, targets per out run, and he's in a list of studs, right? Him and Ayuk are the only guys on this list not to have a top 12 season yet. So, when we look at a list here of his potential comps, and you see names like Mike Evans and Michael Thomas and A.J. Brown, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 comps for him on this list, and 6 of them have top 12 seasons. 2 of them have top 5 seasons. The ceiling is there. He was a good prospect, 11th overall pick, lived up to the hype, and just all time in my database, if you want to look through that, he ranked 8th in PFF receiving grade with an 82.9 among all first-round rookie wide receivers in my database. 13th in points per game with 13.2, 5th in yards per out run with 2.42, and 5th in targets per out run was 26.5%. And this is where the elite ceiling comes in, because we talk about this with tight ends, but it matters for wide receivers as well. You're getting your efficiency one of probably 3 ways. It's going to be touchdowns, it's going to be yards after the catch, and it's going to be average depth of target, right? Because if your average depth of target is super high, you don't have to rely on missed tackles force and stuff, because your yards per reception can probably go toe-to-toe with a guy like Debo's, right? If you're just catching the ball downfield already, not adding anything after the catch, your yards are just coming before the catch instead of after, right? Like if your yards per reception is still coming out similar to a lot of the other top producers, then you're going to be fine in that category. And Olave has kind of shown that with the 9th highest ADOT last year, 14.9 yards downfield. And not only with that, but he's commanding targets at a huge rate. 26.5% target per out run is no joke. That's like a top 12 number last year in the NFL. And when you combine that with the ADOT, we thought maybe he would lack the efficiency because he can't do anything after the catch, but the ADOT's giving him the efficiency, and then he's also getting a lot of volume on top of that, which gives him the ceiling that I thought he didn't really have, right? Like for comparison, Tyler Lockett's going to be a downfield guy, but he's about a 20% target per out run guy. So you can really raise your ceiling if you can, add efficiency before the catch, but then also command targets like a true alpha in the NFL. It kind of makes up for not having that after the catch ability. So that's why I'm kind of back in on Chris Olave. I think I was just being a little bit too, I don't really know what the right word is for it. I was all in on Dynasty. I already had him as a top 8 wide receiver in Dynasty ahead of Drake London, but I think given what he did in year 1, you can't rule out a crazy ceiling because we've seen year 2 wide receiver jumps are crazy, and I don't think we can assume a low ceiling until he shows us he has a low ceiling, right? If he comes out this year and he caps out at 15 points per game, then no harm, no foul. We go into next year, and he settles out in that like Calvin Ridley, Amari Cooper, whatever range. If he balls out like crazy, he's a 1-2 turn pick. So you might as well kind of pay to find out with Chris Olave, and it just makes sense to buy in. Again, like 11th overall pick, looked amazing reception perception, right? Like almost a whole green route tree, 83rd percentile versus man, 73rd versus zone, 83rd versus press. He's like a true technician. He gets open, has the efficiency ceiling because of the ADOT. He commands targets, year 2 breakout. Lots of reason to buy in. The only thing that I don't love and why I had him lower as well, not just his profile, but this Dennis Allen offense isn't great. They were the 4th slowest offense last year. They were 7th lowest in pass attempts per game. Possibly that changes with Derek Carr. Mike Clay has him at 21st pass attempts, which is fine, right? You're probably like a little bit below average. But I will say, even if it's a lower volume pass offense, it should be fine. We've seen Derek Carr support Michael Crabtree, Amari Cooper, Darren Waller, Devontae Adams, whatever. It really shouldn't be all that difficult. And I'm not really worried about Michael Thomas. Like until Michael Thomas proves to us, like we haven't seen Michael Thomas do anything substantial in the last like 3 years. Until he proves that he's the guy that he was in like 2020, 2019. I don't think you can move Chris Olave down for a guy who's going in like the 8th round of fantasy drafts, But after that, we have J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins, I moved him from my 601 as my RB19 to my 502 as my RB16. So I moved him up 3 running back spots and about a round. And I'm really coming around on J.K. Dobbins as like the running back to draft in the dead zone without any hesitation this year. Again, we don't like drafting running backs in the dead zone, right? Like J.K. Dobbins going like 5th, 6th round. Usually I like taking wide receivers there, but it's kind of like, it's one of those rare years where it feels like all of the good wide receivers are on bad offenses. So I'm not like crazy. I'm not dying to take in the 6th round Deontay Johnson or Marquise Brown or Michael Pittman, right? Or Mike Evans, Chris Godwin. We've talked about Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, but it's not catastrophic to miss out on those profiles, right? Like once like Judy, Christian Watson, DJ Moore are gone, I think it's a pretty flat tier of wide receiver, which is when I'm down to lean in to a J.K. Dobbins. Now, when we talk about J.K. Dobbins, solid second round prospect. Would call him like a similar tier prospect to a guy like Javonte Williams or Kenneth Walker coming out, right? Second round pick, just solid across the board. He was ultra efficient in his rookie year. J.K. Dobbins, he was second in rushing yards over expected per attempt, first in yards per carry, seventh in yards after contact per attempt, second highest breakaway run percentage. He was the RB10 in points per game from week 11 onward. Despite officially only starting in one game and going over 60% of the snaps in just 3 games in that rookie season. He was really, really efficient. He looked really talented. Then, of course, preseason of that following year, he tears his ACL, and then he never gets back to 100% last season, but he was still pretty damn good. Like people, like it's so crazy what Dobbins did off of a torn ACL. He came back too early, weeks 3 through 6, and then they throw him back in there weeks 14 through 19, which week 19 is going to be the first round matchup for Cincinnati. He never plays, like he never even really plays over 50% of the snaps, but 120 yards total on like what's that, like 15 carries and no receptions, 128 yards total on 13 carries and 1 reception, 59 yards, 93 yards, 105 yards. Like it's pretty crazy. Like even just last year, fighting through injury, he was 5th in rushing yards over expected per attempt. He was 2nd in yards per carry. Came back, averages over 100 yards from scrimmage in his final 5 games. Like it's pretty crazy. Like every time J.K. Dobbins has been on the field, he's looked good. It was just a matter of like not being able to shoulder that workload last season. But we have Deepak Chona, who I might have on the channel. He follows me on Twitter. He seems like a sharp guy. Let me know if you want to hear from Deepak Chona. And I feel like I'm butchering his name, man. That can't be how you say it. But he's been kind of one of my go-to like doctor types on Twitter. He's like a sports surgeon out of like Stanford. He's like numbers oriented, and he talks to J.K. Dobbins here, he talks to J.K. Dobbins. He said he's betting on the comeback here. He said first year off of ACL and LCL and meniscus is brutal for RBs. It's a brutal injury that he tore his meniscus, LCL, and ACL. There's like some hip damage. It was terrible. So the performance dip and elevated injury risk projected to hit Dobbins for 19 months, which is now over. Expecting the stud who hit 100 yards per game, 6.5 yards per carry in his last 5 games. So he's saying that the ramifications from that injury that you can kind of expect over a long period is now over. Dobbins should kind of be back to his normal self, which is really interesting, right? Because we get him in this new offense under Todd Monken, who is going to pass the ball much more. He's going to run a higher paced offense, and that should, lighten up the boxes for J.K. Dobbins. You're still going to get monster efficiency because he's in a backfield with Lamar Jackson, and he's good at running the ball. And I think that there's more pass catching upside as well than you would think. He had over 20 catches all 3 seasons at Ohio State University. Not even Ezekiel Elliott did that when he was at Ohio State University. And I mean, like, assuming the Ravens add nothing to this backfield, like, it wouldn't shock me if J.K. Dobbins was the 3-down guy. Like, why not have him out there on passing downs? Like, Gus Edwards, someone I'm betting against, he's still having knee issues from a similar injury as J.K. Dobbins last year. He's had more complications there. And you just have Justice Hill, who's, like, never played meaningful snaps in his entire career. I mean, like, I kind of like Justice Hill coming out. Maybe he ends up being the satellite back, but it wouldn't shock me if Dobbins ends up getting some of those passing down looks or snaps, whatever. So I'm all in on J.K. Dobbins. I think this offense is going to be great this year. I think the offense is going to be great. And J.K. Dobbins, every time he's been on the field, has looked good, and he's now presumably healthy. Now, after that, we have Cam Akers, who I had before this video as my 802 as my RB23 in my rankings. He is now my 701 as my RB21. So I moved him like just 2 running back spots, but I moved him about a whole tier in like a round, because he's kind of one of these dead zone-ish running backs that I don't mind prioritizing, right? We're talking like a 7th round pick here. So again, that's not really dead zone. Like that gets to a spot where it's late enough that you're not passing up on, your Christian Watsons and your Jerry Judys and your DJ Moores and your Drake Londons and like these young, exciting wide receivers. You're kind of passing on like a bunch of sort of whatever, right? Like Gabe Davis, Kadarius Toney. I mean, I like those guys, but if I have no running backs by then, or like just one running back, I'm fine with Cam Akers. And I would say that he is kind of the classic dead zone back, but he's not as expensive as the other ones, right? Like Miles Sanders is like a whole like round or 2 ahead of him. And he's similar where you're drafting the guy because of projected touches, right? And we look at Cam Akers. He is in a super, super weak running back room here with Kyron Williams, Sony Michel, and Zach Evans. Guys, like Mike Clay has them all projected for like under 120 carries in this offense. Cam Akers should be the main guy, and we've seen year in and year out with guys like Todd Gurley that Sean McVay, when he has a running back in his offense, he likes to use them pretty much as like a bell cow, right? Like last year, Cam Akers early on, week 1, he almost like delegated Darrell Henderson to be like the full bell cow. Like he usually likes going with a guy who's going to get a majority of the snaps. I think last year was a little bit weird because he had kind of a weird running back room going on. But Cam Akers like also just had a really weird year as well, where like first week he comes out, people who like started him in their lineup, right? He was like a 4th round pick last year. Boom, 16.4%. Kind of like sucks. Like through week 5 wasn't great at all. He like takes like a hiatus where there's like a bye week, and then it's like, are they going to cut Cam Akers? Are they going to trade him? And then they end up just out of nowhere cutting Darrell Henderson. And the rest of the year, Cam Akers just goes absolutely bananas, right? 19 points, right? So we're week 13 on 19 points, 9.3, 13, 34.7, 14.3, 15.8. He was the RB5 in points per game from week 13 on. And I'm kind of open to this idea that Deepak Chona goes through here, that Cam Akers' post-Achilles RB production did last 2+ years for many and projected to affect most of his 22 season. Looks like he bounced back early. Last 3 games put up 136 yards per game, 1 touchdown per game. Expect return to his pre-Achilles trajectory. So what he's saying is maybe the Achilles was still affecting Cam Akers even, 2 years plus out, which kind of makes sense, right? We saw like Deonta Foreman really struggled to kind of like figure out his career early on, and then like about like 2 years after the Achilles tear, he comes back and he was great on the Panthers. He was great on the Titans. He gets a contract this year on the Bears. Maybe it's similar with Akers, right? Where it was like 2 years ago, and last year was still affecting him, and then he kind of finally started to like get his mojo back and get his balance and his twitch back. So that's exciting, right? If you can draft a Cam Akers, if you can draft a pre-Achilles Cam Akers with no competition in his backfield in the 7th round, probably something you should do. Now, the only real concerns with this offense, you have an old Matthew Stafford, but it should be a little bit better than it was last year, right? Because we didn't have Matthew Stafford. He was like hurt, and the whole offense was terrible. Offense should bounce back a little bit. I will say the biggest downside of this is that the Rams have the 28th ranked offensive line according to PFF, so that's not great. But again, I think that's kind of like priced in, right? Like you're just kind of buying cheap volume. 7th round, not super expensive. Like I can kind of get there on Cam Akers. Now, the last guy we'll talk through here is going to be Samaje Perine. He was my 1008 as my RB39. He's now my 906 as my RB34. So I moved him up about a round in like 5 running back spots. And he's interesting because you guys know I'm prioritizing almost at all times late season production, right? We're drafting rookies who break out towards the playoffs. We're drafting Breece Hall, who, sort of projects to be somebody that could smash down the stretch. Like, I am prioritizing the playoff weeks because that's where we make the money. But when we talk about like 9th, 10th round, like I think some people like almost like they'll draft early on for week 1 projections. I think that's the wrong way to play fantasy. Like, I'd rather play early on. I want to spend picks on players that could blow up towards the end of the season, and then later on you can kind of fill those gaps with guys who are more like first half of the season, kind of like trying to think of the right word, but almost like sparklers that kind of like, their shine dies out pretty quick. Samaje Perine's kind of that guy, and I kind of love it because 9th, 10th round, again, it's not a big opportunity cost, and if you're drafting like a 0 RB team, or if you draft like a Breece Hall or a Jahmyr Gibbs, like some of these running backs might get off to like a slowish start, you can just plug in Samaje Perine, and he can be pretty damn good for you. Deepak Chona, right, the whole reason to sort of buy into Perine is the Javonte Williams injury, right? So Deepak Chona goes into it, he said, glad to see Javonte Williams is optimistic. This is when Javonte said he's going to play week 1 like a few weeks ago, which is just insane cap from him. I mean, I hope he proves me wrong. I hope that he's healthy and doing well. But Deepak Chona says, but playing week 1 equals 3 months ahead of average and 2 ahead of Jakob Dobbins in 2023. So we'd expect this to take some time. He said young RBs average 3 to 4 games to ramp up touches, and the first year is associated with major overall performance hit. Dobbins likely just cleared his. Javonte will, but probably not before week 8. So pretty much what he's saying here is Dobbins suffered pretty much the same injury in the preseason, and he wasn't ready for week 1. And Javonte suffered the same injury, but in week 4, right? So in terms of the recovery timeline and J.K. Dobbins getting on the field around like week 3, he was coming from the preseason, whereas Javonte is about like 6 weeks behind him. So that's an issue, right? That could be a spot where like he's not playing until like week 6 or like week 5, and you get like these almost like bell cow games from Samaje Perine. And it's going to be an uphill battle for Javonte Williams anyways, right? Like he's likely never going to be at 100% this year. If he is, maybe it's like really down like the last 5 games. But you have the upside here where like if we just look at these J.K. Dobbins game logs, you can see like he comes out there, or no, this is Cam Akers. But if you look at the J.K. Dobbins game logs, he doesn't play till week 3, and then he plays week 3 under 50% of the snaps. Week 4 hovers around 50%. Week 5 under 50%. Week 6 under 50%, and then he takes time off until week 14. So like imagine this could be what Javonte Williams is looking like. And on top of that, J.K. Dobbins again, he suffered the same injury much earlier than Javonte Williams, right? So he had about like 6 weeks of recovery timeline leeway on Javonte, and he's still like really struggled to get on the field. So like Javonte could get back, and then you could have like a setback where he plays like 4 weeks and he doesn't play, and he's like, you know, maybe like the 1B to Samaje Perine 1A. Like I think Samaje is going to have the floor to himself, and then Javonte could come back, tweak something. Like Javonte could just never get back to a full workhorse load this year, and you see like kind of a 50-50 split, which I think is still going to be valuable in a Sean Payton offense. And the cherry on top is that Perine's going to be a bell cow early on in an empty running back room. Like the only other running backs in this room are Tyler Beatty and Tony Jones, like two guys where if they waived those running backs, I'm not sure anybody picks them up off the waivers, you know? So in an offense that I want to bet on to bounce back with Russell Wilson, and we get Samaje Perine, who's going to have games all to himself early on, and then have the upside where if like Javonte has any setbacks or anything, you know, you get extended period of time of Samaje Perine just being a nice serviceable RB2 for you. I kind of love him. And I even went and checked out just kind of like what can you expect from Samaje Perine in week 1. I went to Number Fire is a website. I think that JJ Zachariason used to work for them. But they already have week 1 fantasy projections. Now you can talk about like if they're accurate or whatever, but they're just a rough account of what you can expect in week 1, right? These are not perfect by any means, but you can see I ordered it by Underdog ADP. Samaje Perine at 105.5. He's the only one projected for 12 plus points per game until you get to James Conner all the way at 84. So that's like, what's that, like 15? No, it's like 20 picks. 20 picks of value in terms of what you can start in week 1. And he even projects similarly in week 1 to guys like Miles Sanders and Cam Akers, who I like Cam Akers, and we just talked about them, but they're going like the 60s, right? So you can pay a fraction of that price for a guy who's going to produce similarly early on in the year, and then as the upside for Javonte Williams to kind of have some setbacks and not be as great. And he's just kind of the perfect complement to those guys up at the top that are a little bit lower, right? Like Jahmyr Gibbs and Breece Hall in terms of week 1 projection. And with Samaje Perine, like, he's never been a great running back, right? Like obviously he's never won all pros or gone to the Pro Bowl, but he's very capable. He averages in 16 career games with 10 or more carries. He averages about 15 points per game. He has a pace of 47 catches and 391 yards through the air, and a pace of 267 carries and 1,031 yards on the ground. And that's pretty like we're talking 1,000 yards on the ground with like flirting with 50 receptions. Like that's really good. So he makes a lot of sense to me if you're light at running back or you need early season production at running back in that like 9th, 10th round range. Samaje Perine, a guy who I kind of just wanted to disregard early on in the offseason. I think he has his place in certain builds. Now, that is going to do it for us today. As always, if you want to see the full entire top 150 ranks, I actually just updated them today for the DeAndre Hopkins news. So we have my top 150 out, and then we also have the downloadable top 150. I also updated, I have the sheet where if you download it, you can upload it straight to Underdog and use my rankings there. So again, patreon.com/Ron Stewart for the rankings. If you want to use them on Underdog, make sure you hop on Underdog. If your first time there, promo code Ron, we get you a deposit match up to $100. Now, that is going to do it for us today, I believe. Don't hold me to it. I believe we're going to have a crazy ambassador video tomorrow. We're back on our grind. It's summer. It's redraft season. It is the summer of best ball. And as always, I love you guys, and I will see y'all in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, oh, oh.